just had snow 2 days ago. So the leaves are off the trees and the fun has begun. So this is sort of where I keep bees. On the right is a satellite image of the Champlain Valley. This is Lake Champlain. It was discovered by Europeans in 1609 by Samuel de Champlain, who came down from Quebec City, which is up there, if you see on the right where Montreal is, the largest French-speaking city outside France. That's on the St. Lawrence Seaway, which flows from Lake Ontario up past Quebec City, around the Gaspé Peninsula, and into the Atlantic Ocean. And northeast of Montreal, it's not visible, but is Quebec City. And so Samuel de Champlain marched down from Quebec City with the Montagnais, the resident Indians, and they showed him Lake Champlain. Well, the Montagnais were one tribe, and the Mohawk, the Iroquois Nation, the Mohawks were on the west side of the lake. But the Mohawks had control of the lake. Of course, the lake was the main channel, the main travel channel, the main shipping channel for the Indians at that time. And so the Montagnais and the Abenakis, who are in my area, they stayed away from the lake because that wasn't their territory. But they wanted control of the lake. And so Samuel de Champlain and the Montagnais had a meeting with the Mohawk chiefs. And the Mohawk chiefs lined up on one side, and the Montagnais lined up on the other side with the French behind them. And the Montagnais separated, and the Frenchmen leveled their rifles and shot all the Mohawk chiefs dead. That was the beginning of the French and Indian War. But that's where I live. Lots of history along that lake. All Indian history, French and Indian War, the Revolution. The British general marched down the lake towards New York City and got beat up by the colonists along the way. And that was sort of the end of that one. But if you look at the right-hand picture, the map, if you go to the north end of Lake Champlain, right on the Canadian border, that's where I keep my bees, on both sides of Lake Champlain. And we talk about a frozen North America, about the cold winter I have. You know, you folks are lucky in one way because you have the Gulf Stream. And so it keeps you fairly moderate. Well, we don't have the Gulf Stream. We have the prevailing winds coming from the northwest. And if you look at a map of North America and you see Lake Hudson Bay way up there in the north by where the snow is, if you go northwest, right from there, you go right through my front door. And so the prevailing winds from during the winter are from that northwest, and it just brings that cold air right down. The jet stream goes up on the western side states and comes right down across me. Every once in a while, the jet stream will move a little bit to the east, and we'll be in the warm part of the jet stream. And in those cases, we get a cleansing flight. Our bees get a cleansing flight in January or February. But if that doesn't happen, they go all the way from sometime in December until sometime in April with never a cleansing flight. I have to laugh when you mention your winter. And Peter Little tells me that Boxing Day they're bringing in pollen. And in January is the start of brood rearing. And by March he's got swarm cells. Well, we had our first pollen came in on April 1st this year. And our first cleansing flight was on April 1st this year, and our first pollen came in on April 15th. So we have a long season, and that's part of the issue with wintering bees where I live, is the fact that they don't have a cleansing flight for 4 or 5 months. And so you have to have bees that are really adapted to living in that kind of a climate. So this is our first snowstorm. Last year, in November. That's my house and my Hereford cow, which is really just a brush cutter. And she keeps the brush eaten down in our fields. And that's where the shed she lives in. And she does pretty well. So we have a snowstorm early. And The bees start to get some snow on their bonnets. And this is probably December. This is about what it looks like in December. And you know, her name is Meat. And Meat says, come on, I thought you said we weren't going to have a winter this year. Yes, well, we are, Meat, we're going to have a winter this year. And so then everybody gets the idea. And the mourning doves try to hide their heads. But, you know, there's nothing much you can do about it. And eventually we get some real snow. And then these 3 brood box chambered hives, that's what it looks like. This is the kind of snow we get. Sometimes we can't find the bee yards. I've been out in March before with snowshoes and a toboggan and a long-handled shovel, and I get out to the middle of my bee yard, and it's as if somebody's stolen my bees. I mean, I know I'm in the bee yard. I mean, I know the trees. I've been there for 30 years. I know where I am, and the bees are out of sight. And the only way we can find them is with a long-handled shovel poking down through the snow until it hits something, boom. Oh, there they are, and we dig them out because it's predicted that we're going to have a cleansing flight in March. And the bees are still buried under the snow in March. They don't suffocate. They melt a little chamber around them. There's a chamber of snow melted. And in fact, there's a chimney that the warm air rising out of the upper entrance melts a chimney up through the snow to the surface. Now, they don't go up the chimney and out and fly, but they're able to ventilate and breathe. So finally, we get a day when they can finally have a cleansing flight after several months of nothing. And so if you happen to be in your bee yard on that day, it's a good idea to wear a hat. And finally, they can get some water. You get some melting of the snow and ice. It collects under the stone that holds the cover down. And they're able to stick their tongues under there and get a little drink of water, because they do need water, the same as us. And then the snow starts to melt, and we get some temperatures in the 40s. And the sap starts to run, and the sugar makers start to boil the sap and make that maple syrup that everybody loves. And then the poplar trees, we call them poplar, they're quaking aspen, they get their flowers, and everything starts to bloom. And then we get the catkins on the speckled alders and the pussy willows. And then that's when brood rearing starts, when they finally have some real pollen coming in. So we're talking about the first half of April. So I don't know when your pussy willows bloom, but I bet it's long before the first half of April. And then our maple blooms, and that sometimes can be a pretty good flow. So this is a maple, a silver maple on the left and a red maple on the right. And that usually kicks it off well. If you have supers on in time, I've seen the bees fill supers on maple, which is pretty incredible. It takes a strong colony in warm weather, unusually warm weather, and a good flow. And then it really hits the fan, and the dandelions start to bloom. And the dandelion bloom that we get it's blindingly yellow. It's amazing how much, I've seen 60-pound crops off the dandelion flow. Unfortunately, this year, the first half of May was so dry that there was not one bee on the dandelion flow. And then it started to rain, and it rained from the middle of May until the beginning of July. Something similar to what you saw. So what they were saying was going to be the driest May on record turned into the wettest May on record and the wettest June on record. And Lake Champlain was 103.82 feet, and the record high before that was 102.5, and all the boat docks and all the ferry docks and all the camps along the lake washed away. And the surface area of Lake Champlain gained something like 6,000 acres. And then the apples bloom. And then we have some pretty decent gardening weather. And we try to get our tomatoes, excuse me. We try to get our tomatoes ripe. Some years we get them and some years we don't. And then it turns into the autumn flow with all the different flowers. And we have goldenrod and we have aster. You know, our goldenrod, again, the fields get so yellow that it's blindingly yellow. And you get goldenrod and you buy it from a package and you put it in your flower garden. And we get New England aster and small white aster and flat-topped white and multi-flowered white and heart-leafed and all these different asters. And they'll bring aster pollen in even after freeze up. Everything can be frozen solid, and if you get a day where it warms up a little bit, they'll start bringing pollen in again. Where they get that pollen, I haven't got a clue. You look, and there's no flowers. You can't find any flowers anywhere. Everything's turned brown. And yet the bees are bringing in aster pollen, so they just have this way of finding things. And then we have, this is my backyard. Isn't that nice? And the leaves just go flaming red and yellow, and the beavers know what's going on, and they've stashed all their food for winter, and they're hunkered down in their house. This is a beaver pond across from my house. And then it comes again. And as I said, it just snowed the other day, and before the end of November, we'll have snow on the ground for good, and it might melt by sometime in April. And again, the birds can't believe it, and they try to hide their heads, but there's nothing they can do. And that's my season. So we pretty much work around the snowstorms. But successful beekeeping in the north requires three things. It requires suitable bees. The bees have to be able to do it. It requires population management, and it requires timely winter preparations. The bees that I like to have for wintering have to be raised from stocks that have gone through a winter successfully. If you don't select from bees that have gone through a winter successfully, you're just kidding yourself, because you don't know what you're going to get. But these bees maintain a quiet cluster all through the winter. You know, in the winter, in the middle of your winter, you could go put your ear on the side of the hive, and can't you hear a little hum? You can hear them. You can tell they're alive by putting your ear against the hive. Well, good bees, where I am, you can't hear them hum because they're absolutely quiet, stone dead quiet. You open up the crown board and you look in and you see a cluster of bees, but you're sure that they're dead. And if you pester them enough, some of them will stick their little butts up in the air, but that's about it. You get some bees working like this. They don't move. They don't hum. They aren't active at all. They aren't increasing the indigestibles in their gut. They're not eating any food. They'll eat 10 pounds a month maybe. A big colony of bees, a huge colony of bees, eating only 10 pounds a month. And that's what happens. And those are the kind of bees I want. Bees that are able to withstand long periods of time without cleansing flights. So how do you tell if you have a colony of bees that's strong enough in the spring, that's come through the winter well with a good population of bees? Rather than take that colony apart, this is just after snow melt. It's still chilly. It's still too cold to examine beehives. So if you just walk up to that hive and give them a good rap with your foot, you find out whether a colony is strong or not. When you see a colony like this with 3 brood boxes, and there's bees coming out the top entrance, and bees coming out of the bottom entrance, and bees coming out of any hole in the box, you can walk away from that colony because you know that it's ready to go. This is what I like to see in the spring, early. The first time I examine a colony in the spring, I like to see good clusters. But you can see the difference between these two clusters. One's a nice tight cluster. One's a loose cluster. That nice tight cluster, I can look down at the comb that's visible, and I can see capped honey there. I see a cluster like that. I see capped honey in contact with the cluster. I put the crown board back on and walk away. But when I see a colony like the one on the right, while it's a lovely looking colony, it may be running out of food. But again, I don't want to pull combs out, so what do? I jab my hive tool in the seams of bees near the outside seams of bees, and if it comes up with honey on it, I know that they're okay because they're in contact with honey. If I can't find any honey that the bees are in contact with, I have to feed that colony. So since my talks are mostly geared towards trying to convince beekeepers to stop buying packaged bees from faraway places, hence this slide, do your packaged bees from faraway places fit that bill? And in most cases, you're going to have to say no, because these bees are energetic and in the hive, loose cluster, humming. Every time you open up the hive, they're running around. They aren't able to winter. I believe our job as beekeepers is to maintain each of our stocks in the strongest condition as possible. That's what leads to successful beekeeping. In other words, population management. You need to manage your population. No, this is not a normal colony. This is actually a shook colony made from mating nukes that were overpopulated. So this is what I refer to as my 25-pound package. But I think you get the idea. And that management must start early in the season, at that time when I'm first looking to see if the colony is strong enough and if it has any feed reserves. I can walk by a colony of bees and see something like this. This is a good sign. This means that that colony is strong enough to have been cleaning out any winter refuse, any rubble that comes because of their wintering, because of their uncapping honey. So if I find a colony that's light on stores, I need to give them some feed. Right at this time of year, and we have such a short season, that we don't want any break in brood rearing. We don't want them to shut brood rearing down for any reason. And if a colony gets near running out of feed, and that doesn't mean they have to starve, they don't have to be in starvation conditions, all they have to do is get below a threshold. They'll shut down, the queen will stop laying. So you have to make sure that you have a feed supply if they haven't got ample food. So you feed them. Another problem, they've started brood rearing, but there's no pollen coming in from the field. Again, if that colony runs out of pollen that's been stored in the hive last autumn, brood rearing shuts down right at the wrong time, right when you don't want them to shut down. So you feed them pollen, or you give them a pollen substitute that provides them with the protein that they need to continue brood rearing uninterrupted. We equalize the brood. We equalize the amount of brood in a hive so that you don't have weak hives and strong hives. You have pretty much equal hives. You can do this by removing brood from one strong colony and adding it to a weaker colony. And some people will exchange position with a stronger colony and a weaker colony so that the stronger colony gives up some of its force and the weaker colony gets that force with increased field force. You can requeen weak colonies with a caged queen, or what I prefer is to requeen a weaker colony with an overwintered nucleus colony. So I can take a colony that's only got 2 or 3 frames of brood when they should have far more than that. I can get rid of that old queen, give them an overwintered nucleus colony that's got 5 or 6 or 7 frames of brood, and instantly they have a young queen and as much brood as a strong overwintered colony, immediately. And then we have this. Then we have this dandelion bloom that will surely kick the bees into swarming condition. This is predominantly dairy country. When I go to the southern states and they talk about dandelions, they don't realize what I'm talking about. They have a little patch of dandelions here and there. I'm flying into Virginia and there's 6 inches of snow on my front lawn and everything's green and flowering, and I get down below a certain 1,000 feet and I can start to see dandelions. Dandelions around the fence posts, dandelions around the signposts, but nothing else. No fields of dandelions. We're really lucky with this because it's a huge flow right when they need one. Then we have to manage swarm control. You don't want them to swarm. You want them to continue their buildup until the main honey flow. We're trying to maximize population. We're managing our population to get the highest population possible, so when we do get that honey flow, they can take full advantage of it. So what do? We can make spring splits. That controls population. It reduces the eventual population. As a young beekeeper, I was always told, if you split your beehive at dandelion time, and our main honey flow is 5 weeks later, it only takes a colony 4 weeks to build back up to full population. So no problem, you split your hives. Well, personally, I don't think they ever rebuild themselves to full population, because population is exponential. The more brood you have, the more bees you have. And the more bees you have, the more brood you have. And so on and so on. And you can build gigantic populations in colonies ready for honey gathering, but I don't believe you can do it if you split your colony in the spring. Hence why I don't split colonies in the spring unless swarm preparations have started. Splitting a colony for swarm control should be absolutely the last resort in your swarm control, not the first resort. Too many people rely on it as the first and only resort. You need to super properly. You need to have room above the brood nest for overhead nectar storage. You need to super early. When I was first starting out, I was told, don't put the supers on until after the dandelion bloom, because the dandelion bloom is quick to granulate, and it's got a very strong flavor. It's not a particularly good tasting honey. So you don't put the supers on, and then the dandelion won't be in the supers. Well, if it's not in the supers, where do you think it is? It's in the brood nest. So what's the prime trigger for swarming? To me, the prime trigger for swarming is when nectar goes in the brood nest, where brood is emerging. See, the field bees, the forager bees come in from the field with their nectar load, and they give it to a receiver bee. They don't take it to a cell and put it in a cell. They give it to a receiver bee. The receiver bee takes it to a cell and puts it in the cell and goes back to get another load. Now these receiver bees, they don't go to a specific place in the hive like above, up in the supers. Psh, Seeley tells me, psh. That's not always necessarily true. They go psh, and they go psh, and they go psh. They put it everywhere. They put it wherever they can get to it as soon as they can get to it to go get another load, because that's their job. Quick, quick, quick. Well, what happens if, and then at nighttime when the flow ends, then they move the nectar up and out of the brood nest, overhead if they're supers, and that's the process. And the next day they repeat it. Well, what happens if there are no supers on, or if there's no overhead nectar storage space for that nectar to be moved up and out of the brood nest? It stays in the brood nest. The only place the bees can put that nectar is where brood's emerging. But the queen wants to lay there. But the nectar gatherers want to put nectar there. And so there's a competition between brood rearing and nectar storage. And guess who wins? The nectar storers. And so that forces the cluster lower in the hive. The queen can't find a place to lay, and bang, swarm preparations begin. That, to me, is the prime trigger for swarming. So in your swarm preparations, this is what you're trying to avoid. The only way we can do that is to super before the dandelion bloom. But you get dandelion honey in your supers. Well, I would much prefer to have dandelion honey in my supers than my bees hanging in the trees. So I finally figured it out. I finally figured out that if I put supers on early enough, nectar is not going to go in the brood nest. Not right off. Eventually it will, but not right off. So the second time around, after they've started filling up their supers, now I don't use queen excluders, and yes, the queen will go up into the super, maybe the bottom super. I put 2 on at one time, as you can see. The bottom 4 boxes in this are brood nest, and the top 3 boxes are honey supers. But eventually, as the flow increases, the nectar storers will be storing nectar in the top brood box, and the same thing is going to happen. Brood will be emerging, nectar will be stored where the brood is emerging, the trigger is pulled, and swarm preparations begin. So then what do? Sometimes just putting another super doesn't help. So we do what's called reversing, where we reverse the brood chambers. Reversing the brood chambers puts empty comb space one more time above the active brood nest. The queen feels like she can move up. She's not restricted. She's not held down by incoming nectar. She's not held down by queen excluders. She has full reign of my beehive, called the Unlimited Brood Nest Management System. She can go wherever she wants. I don't care. Some queens need more room. If you restrict them in any way, they're going to start swarm preparations. So what we're doing is we're reversing the colony. We're putting empty brood comb on top of the active brood nest, and they're able to move up. So this is a colony that I'm going to reverse. It's got its 2 supers on already. First thing I do is I crack up the two supers. Now they've fastened everything together, so I don't worry about taking 1 super off at a time. I take the 2 supers off together. I can crack the 2 supers up and look at the bottom bars. I don't pull frame after frame after frame and look for queen cells and look to see what's going on. Instead, I crack the 2 supers where they join the brood box, and I tip it up and I look at the bottom, and I look for queen cells. If I see no queen cells, I take the 2 supers off, I put them on an upturned cover, and now I have the brood nest exposed. Do I start pulling frames of brood out and looking for queen cells and examining the brood? No. You know, when you're working with your bees, and if you're trying to pull the top brood box off, things happen, like they stick the frames together. So you're trying to get the brood box apart, and the frames are stuck together. So you've got your smoker stuck between your thighs, and you're bent over, and you're trying to get, and you're trying to lift, and and you wind up hurting your back. And you've just ended your beekeeping career. You have to be careful of your back. So rather than pick up 1 box at a time, all that does is drive the bees to the bottom of the hive. So by the time you get to the bottom of the hive, you can't see anything anyway because it's so full of bees. You start working from the bottom of the hive. Imagine examining the colony from the bottom. But this is a very good way to do it. So you lay the colony on its back, right on the ground. You remove the bottom board with a minimum of smoke, and the first thing I look for is the cluster. Do I see empty combs? Or do I see a cluster hanging down to the bottom of the hive? If it's hanging to the bottom of the hive, you know you have a very populous hive. If you can't see a cluster of bees, there may be an issue. They're up higher in the hive. Very little bit of smoke. If I see the bees hanging, I mark on my yard sheet that it's a strong colony of bees at this time. Now I can crack apart the top brood box without straining my back, without being contorted and trying to pick the box up and separate the frames from the ones above them. I can use gravity to help me. So I just crack the box apart, like this. I'm not picking anything up. All the weight is laying on the ground. I'm just opening the box up like this and looking underneath the frames to see what's going on. Do I see queen cells? Do I see sealed brood? How much sealed brood? Well, I can look at that box like this. I'm looking for queen cells, and there we are. So this colony is in the early stages of swarm preparation. I know that. Now I have to inspect that colony. If I want to know how much brood this colony has relative to other colonies, I start from one side of the box, and I look in and I look at the frames. You can open the frames. You can spread apart the frames like the pages of a book, the leaves of a book, and I come in from one side like this until I see the first frame of sealed brood. And I come in from the other side of the box until I see the first frame of sealed brood. And I count all those frames inclusively. I'm trying to get a number that I can compare all the colonies in that apiary. So this isn't actually a number written in stone. This isn't a perfect way to do it. There may be a frame of pollen in there. There may be a frame that doesn't have brood on it. But I'm actually looking at the size of that cluster of all inclusive of brood. So if I see 5 combs inclusive of the 2 frames of sealed brood, I write in my head 5. If there's queen cells, they have to be dealt with, but I keep track of that number, 5. I sit down, shake the bees off the combs. If there's queen cells, I cut them all off, make sure there isn't 1 cup with an egg, 1 cup with jelly. If there's 1 cup with an egg, you're wasting your time if you leave it there. They're going to swarm anyway. So they have to be, all of them have to be gone. And you have to shake the bees off the combs because the bees will cover the cells. You can't see those cups. There'll be a cup or a cell in a hole in the comb or a depression in the comb and there's bees on it. You can't see it. So you go through the comb, go through the colony, cutting out all the cells, and then you go to the next box. And you do the same thing with the next box. You may wonder, you see cells that are older cells. And if you cut the queen cells out of a colony that's got older cells and they've already swarmed, what's going to happen? You're going to have a dead colony because you've made them hopelessly queenless. So how do you tell if a colony has or hasn't swarmed when you're doing this? You could look through a comb and say, oh, I see eggs. So this colony hasn't swarmed. Yes, but those eggs could have been laid 2 days ago. And the queen could have swarmed yesterday because it takes 3 days for the eggs to hatch. So just finding eggs in a colony doesn't necessarily mean that the colony hasn't swarmed. It hasn't swarmed, it could have swarmed a number of days ago. So if you look at the brood cycle in a colony, they start with larvae. You know, it's an okay queen, I guess. Pretty good. It's a nice brood pattern. It's a lovely larval pattern. And then the brood gets sealed, and the brood starts to emerge. And you find a comb of brood that has a comb of brood that is just starting to emerge, that's just started to emerge in the last few hours. Where's the queen's favorite place in the world to lay eggs? Her favorite place in the world to lay eggs is where brood is emerging. So as soon as that brood emerges, she jumps right on those combs and starts to lay. And so this patch in the middle of this frame of brood that's just started to emerge in the last few hours winds up with something like this. So if you have a decent population, a good population, a population that has enough bees to have supported all that brood, and you find eggs like that in newly emerged brood, you can be pretty confident that the colony has not swarmed yet. And so you can continue cutting out the queen cells. You put what was the middle of the 3 boxes back on the first box. Remember, the box on the bottom there was on the top of the brood nest. So you put this box back on. If there were queen cells, you remove all the queen cells from this box, clean it up a little bit, put the bottom box back on the top. Now the bottom box in this configuration, since it's so tall, has no brood in it. It's got mostly empty comb. So by putting that empty comb on top of her active brood nest, one more time it's like adding another super. It's like adding comb above her, except it's brood comb. And that's what she wants. So you're giving room for the nectar storers to store their nectar, and you're giving room for the brood rearers to rear their brood. And this is how you stop swarming. This is how I do it. Comb space above the cluster. Is it 100%? Of course it's not 100%. You've seen bees swarm with empty supers. Well, don't forget that swarming is a form of requeening. Some bees actively swarm in order to requeen themselves. Read Honey Farming by Manley, and you'll get a good snootful of that. That bees will swarm just in order to requeen themselves. So you've got them through the early management. You've prevented the swarming. You've got your supers on. They're starting to fill up the supers with honey. You need to go through and super some more. Make sure that you've got enough supers on a colony that they can store any flow that might come along. Honey is 85% water, 85% sugar. Nectar is 85% water. So it takes 2 supers of comb space to store 1 super of finished honey. So you need to stay ahead of these bees by 1 empty super, so that if anything happens, they have a place to store all that thin nectar. So they need surface area. They need comb space to store all that nectar as they're ripening it, as they're getting rid of all that water. If they don't have a place to store all that nectar, you know where it's going to go. It's going to go in the brood nest, and then here we go again. So you need to stay ahead of them in your supering. This business about waiting until the super is 3/4 full before you put another one on is ridiculous. You're just asking for swarming to happen. You need to stay ahead of them. You need to evaluate your queens at this time in midsummer. Some colonies will need to be requeened. You're trying to manage your population. You're trying to have the best population you can for the main honey flows. So you need to evaluate your queens. Does the queen need to be replaced? So traditionally, we pull frames of sealed brood out and look at the pattern and look for that shotgun pattern, that scattered brood pattern with lots of empty holes. Well, as we're introducing queens from the Varroa-sensitive hygiene stock, these bees know that there's an actively reproducing female Varroa under those cells. And they'll pull that pupa out. They'll dismember, they'll butcher that bee pupa just to get at that female, and that stops her from reproducing. But it also makes it look like you have a terrible queen. And so here we are trying to incorporate Varroa-sensitive hygiene bees in our stocks, but we're replacing them because they have shotgun brood patterns, which is exactly what we want because they're ridding the colony of a lot of the Varroa mites. So rather than first looking at, or only looking at the sealed brood pattern, perhaps we should be looking at the unsealed brood pattern. Perhaps we should be looking for something like this, when every cell is full of a larva, and all the larvae next to each other are of the same age or almost the same age. So you can look at this pattern and see from the center of the pattern, they get younger and younger, gradually, evenly, until they get all the way out to the outside of the comb where it's now eggs. This is a very good pattern, and I would certainly not requeen a colony like this. But then we get colonies like these, where the brood pattern is scattered across the frame. There's old ones, and young ones, and sealed ones, and empty ones, and eggs. There's nothing good about this pattern. There's nothing tight about this pattern. It's all over the place. This colony needs to be requeened. This colony, she's a great layer. She's laying like crazy, but look at the pattern. So what happens when this frame is sealed? The ones that are sealed now are going to emerge first, and the ones that were just eggs are going to emerge last. And so that's where your shotgun pattern comes from. So you can predict that pattern just by looking at the unsealed brood pattern, not the sealed brood pattern. What happens if you have a chalk brood colony, but you have a hygienic colony that pulls out the chalk brood mummies as fast as they form? They can tell ahead of time, even before they ever have any spores. You know, the chalk brood mummies, before they get spores, are white, and the chalk brood mummies, after they get spores, are black, like bread mold. They pull those mummies out before they ever form any spores, before they ever can be contagious. The queen relays in that cell, and now that brood is younger than the brood around it. And the brood around it will emerge first, and you'll have your shotgun pattern. But it had some chalk brood, and the bees cleaned it up. And you're going to get rid of the queen because it has a shotgun pattern when it's exactly the queen you want because she's hygienic and she's cleaning up the mess. So you need to look at the unsealed pattern. Something like that. That's a shotgun pattern, probably caused by chalk brood. But you can't find any chalk brood because they've cleaned up the mess and carried it away and dumped it in the field somewhere. So you've determined that a specific colony needs to be requeened. So what do? There's a number of ways to requeen a colony of bees. You can get rid of the old queen and introduce a caged queen, or you can use a push-in cage, or you can use nucleus colonies. With a direct introduction of a queen, you kill the old queen, you pop the candy end cork, you put her in there, she's accepted, starts to lay, and that's okay, that's a viable way, but not perfect, and a number will get rejected because you remember you're taking a laying queen, no matter her quality and how she's doing, you're removing an actively laying queen from a colony, you're putting a queen in there that's been shipped in from somewhere. She's shrunken, her abdomen is small, she's not a laying queen, she doesn't act like a laying queen or smell like a laying queen, she's a non-laying queen. So you're removing a laying queen from a colony and asking them to take a non-laying queen. That doesn't always work. You can use a push-in cage. This is a little bit better. This is a 8-mesh little cage that doesn't have a bottom. It's got 4 sides that are about 3/4 of an inch deep. And the size doesn't matter, something like this. You find a frame of brood that's got emerging brood and nectar. You brush the bees off. You go in your truck or in your vehicle or in your house in front of a window. And you take your queen out of the cage and you find a place on the cage where there's emerging brood and nectar, and you put the cage on the top of the frame, on top of the comb, and you put the queen underneath the cage, and then you carefully move the cage around until you find that sweet spot where there's emerging brood and nectar, and there's no bees. All the bees have been brushed off, and you push that introduction cage, that push-in cage, into the comb up to the midrib, and you put the comb back in the hive. And what happens? That actively emerging brood comes out. They've never seen a queen. They don't even know what a queen is. But doesn't she smell good? And don't they love her? And don't they clean her and feed her? And guess what happens? She comes in to lay. She's got empty cells. She's got nectar. She's being fed. She starts to lay. The rest of the bees in the colony smell her and feed her and try to clean her, but they can't. And 4 days later, you pull the cage off, and all the cells under the cage are full of eggs. And now you have an actively laying queen that acts like a laying queen and smells like a laying queen, and the colony goes about its work. And this works almost every time. It's a wonderful way to requeen a hive. But the best way to requeen with a queen is to start a nucleus colony. Once you get a queen laying in a nucleus colony, if you set up a nucleus colony and the old bees fly back to the original entrance, leaving only young bees behind, young bees always accept a queen, almost always. Old bees will reject a queen. Young bees will accept a queen. So by making nucleus colony from that colony, from the colony to be requeened, and locating it in another part of the yard, the old bees fly back and the young bees accept the queen. Then when the queen is laying and she's established her brood chamber in that little nuke box, you go back to the parent colony, dispatch the old queen, pull some combs out, and give them the nucleus colony. And they're accepted, almost always accepted. So nucleus colonies give you better acceptance for this queen. She gets puffed up, she's a laying queen, and she starts to lay. Well, if you have to take out 5 frames out of the colony to be requeened, to put in the nucleus colony, what do you do with the combs you take out? Do you put them in storage and let the wax moths chew them up? Or do you put them in another hive? Or what do you do with them? So that was my problem. When having hundreds of colonies to requeen, what am I going to do with all these combs, these extra combs? So I came up with something that I call the modified 2-queen system. I'm going to be running a 2-queen colony for a short time. With this method, I get 2 queens laying at the same time. So usually if you're requeening a colony, they're usually short on population. So if you have 2 queens laying in the colony at the same time, building population, while you're waiting to requeen or unite that, you're building population, which is a good thing. You can also evaluate the new queen. Sometimes you get a new queen and you put her in a hive and she's worse or the same or worse than the old queen. So you get to evaluate that queen before you make that final decision. So this is what I call the modified 2-queen system. You identify the colony to be requeened. Now you're doing this because, 1, they have a bad brood pattern, or because they're a poor producer, or because they have chalk brood or some brood disease other than foul brood, or they have a nasty temper, for whatever reason it is. You're getting rid of that queen. You remove the supers if there are any and put them to the side. The top brood box should have brood in all stages. You remove all the combs from that top brood box. You shake the bees out on the ground in front of the hive as you remove those combs from the top brood box, or on a landing board. If it's a cold day, perhaps you would shake them back into the hive as you remove the combs. You shake the bees back into the space created. I do mostly this way. But you have to shake all the bees out of that box. There cannot be any bees left on those combs. So you remove all the combs one at a time, shake the bees, take the empty box off the hive, put the supers back on, put a queen excluder on top of what's left, put your empty box back on top of that queen excluder, and put your now beeless combs. You've shaken all the bees off. Put them back in the empty box. What have you created? You've got the old queen below the queen excluder with what's left of her brood nest, and a honey super or 2 that they're working in, and a queen excluder, and a box of brood and honey with no bees. And you cover it up and you leave it overnight. You come back in the morning and what have you got? You've got the same setup. The bees have reestablished themselves in the upper brood box above the queen excluder, but there are no queens because the bees have run up through the queen excluder, leaving any queens down below the queen excluder, which is a much quicker way and a much more efficient way and a much better way than trying to find those queens or that queen in your hive. Because you all know, we all do it, we don't see her. She's there, but you don't see her, so she winds up above the queen excluder. The next day, you come back, you remove that box, we'll call that the nuke. You remove that nuke from the excluder, you remove the excluder, you reinstall the crown board with the rim facing up and the little entrance notch to the rear of the hive. If you have a feed hole, or what used to be called the escape hole, most people don't know what an escape hole is when you mention an escape hole. An escape hole is that oval hole in the crown board where a porter bee escape used to go in. And that was a method of removing the bees from the honey crop. They'd go down through this little spring device and not be able to get back up. So you tape the feed hole or the escape hole so the bees can't get back down through that hole or communicate with the cluster below. And you put the box of brood and honey with bees but no queen on top of the escape board, like this. And you give it a caged queen. And you cover it. And what happens? They release the queen. Since all the old bees have flown back down, remember the entrance is facing the back, And all the old bees, they know where the entrance is. It's in the front. So all the bees fly out of the top box. Old bees, they return to the bottom entrance, leaving predominantly young bees and emerging brood up above. They want a queen. They'll take a queen. You give them a queen. If you're on a good flow and there's a reasonable population down below, perhaps you need to add another super under the crown board to the original parent colony because you don't want them to swarm at this point. So the new queen establishes her brood nest in the top box, separated from the colony down below. And you leave them there for 3 weeks. Let her get established. Let her get good and strong. Let her get some of her own bees in that hive. And you wind up with something like this. As they get stronger and it gets kind of warm, they have a bee beard. This is the top box. This is their cluster now. She's getting real strong. She's got a colony that's really getting packed with bees because all that brood that you left up there is emerging, has emerged. And she's raising new brood. And so all those bees are part of her cluster now. And you must unite this with the parent colony before they swarm. So what you do is you go down below and you kill the old queen and you put newspaper on top of her box and you put your new box, your nuke, with the new queen on the paper. If you have a number of supers, you don't have to look through those supers. You don't have to worry about uniting them. Put another piece of newspaper. So you've isolated the nuke with the new queen from the old bees and the rest of the hive. They chew through that paper overnight and they join peaceably. Well, what about when you can't find a queen? That happens. You go through the colony down below. You know there's a queen. You can't find her. So you use a shaker box. And you shake all her bees through a shaker box. And lo and behold, there she is. Or there they are. Because on a number of times, you'll find 2 queens. So now you've requeened your hive. You've got a good population again. And you need to get them ready for winter. We're always told that we should get our bees ready in August. We should requeen our bees in August. Well, when do the bees start getting ready for winter? I believe they're getting ready for winter all summer long. They're building a population to gather lots of honey and to make a population of young bees to go forward into the winter. So you're taking your final harvest. You don't take it all. You take only enough. If you take it all, you're taking the pollen. You're taking that pollen reserve. So you leave them enough honey and enough pollen. Whatever is in the brood nest is theirs. You don't take all the honey and feed sugar because you're taking their pollen. Well, you have to check the clusters. You need good clusters in the autumn going forward. How do you do that? By removing combs one at a time? No. All you have to do is tip the top box up and walk away for a couple minutes. And the bees will show themselves. You'll see what size cluster they have because they'll expose themselves just like this. Now you know which ones have to be united. You know which ones are weak and which ones don't have the population they need. Never, ever, ever take a diseased colony into winter. There must be a disease check sometime before autumn so you know you have clean colonies going forward. And as far as I'm concerned, there's one absolute 100% sure cure for American foul brood disease, and that's the torch and the burn pit. You need to feed them. They need to have enough stores for winter and for spring. Just getting through the winter is not enough. They need to get in through the spring until they have a sustainable flow. So how do you do that? You go to the back of the hive and you pick it up. And if you have ever any number of colonies at all, pretty soon they all start to feel heavy. And so you would err on the side of caution and overfeed them. Well, if I was to overfeed all my bees, it would cost me a fortune. So you don't overfeed them. You feed them what you need. So you weigh the colonies with a scale like this so you can get an exact weight and know exactly how much they need. Well, and you can do this by yourself. You're not picking the hive up. That's the idea. All you're doing is tipping the hive sideways and tipping the hive up onto the scale and reading the weight. and feeding them what they need. So if you know your target weight, my target weight is 155 for a 3-chamber brood nest. If I'm 10 pounds under, I give them 1 gallon of thick sugar syrup. If I need to feed them lots, I put it right on the comb, not on the crown board, one at a time. I put all the gallons of syrup they need on top of the frames on shims that I cut on my table saw. I can feed up to 5 gallons at once, and these bees will take this syrup down in a matter of days, whether it be 1 gallon or whether it be 3 gallons or whether it be 5 gallons. And that's the idea. Have you ever fed your bees a quart at a time, and you feed quart after quart after quart, and nothing happens? They don't put any food away. They're not gaining any weight. That's because they're using it. It's being fed to them so slow that they're using it to raise brood. So you need to feed it to them fast. So the faster you can feed it, they take it down, they ripen it, they actually cap it. The bottom bar is littered with wax scales, with piles of wax scales, because they're taking this feed down so fast. They're building new comb, and they cap it and ripen it just like they would nectar. In order to get through our winter, we need a little bit more protection. We need to wrap the hive. We need to protect them from that cold winter. So this is a wrapped colony of bees. It's got a bottom entrance with mouse protection and an upper entrance for ventilation. They've got inner cover insulation and a black wrapper for solar gain. These are the items I need for my wrapping. I cut a piece of tar paper, 15-pound roof felt, lightweight roof felt, approximately 78 inches. That's the size of my hive with an overlap. I fold down the top edge of the paper. I'm not going to wrap this colony like a package over the top, because that just holds the moisture in. You want them to be able to breathe. This is the colony we're going to wrap. Take the cover off. You see that the rim has been put down on the crown board, and the upper entrance has been exposed. I'm going to put some insulation on that crown board, but I want the insulation to sit on the crown board, not on the burr comb, allowing cold air under it. I'm trying to keep the crown board warm. I don't want moisture to condense on the underside of the crown board, because it drips on the bees, and that's what kills our bees. So the feed hole is taped. The crown board is scraped. This is an entrance screen to keep mice out. It's 1/2-inch hardware cloth. It's easily installed. You don't need any pins or nails. It gets full ventilation, this colony. This isn't a piece of metal with little holes drilled in it. This is full wide ventilation, and this is what they need in our climate. This is the screen shoved in the entrance. Raccoons can't pull it out. Mice can't get through it. This is the upper entrance with the foam on top to insulate and keep that crown board warm. So this colony is ready to wrap. You put the wrapper around the hive. You staple it in a number of places in the back. You cut the felt paper so that the upper entrance is exposed, with a staple to hold the paper against the box so the bees don't get lost under the paper, something like this. And on a warmish day, when the sun shines on the paper in the middle of the winter, it could be 10 degrees out. There the bees are looking at you, because it just warms it up enough that they can go and bring a little bit of stores into the space. And this is what a colony looks like, fully wrapped in my area. This one is ready for winter. I don't have to look at this colony again until March, when I might check it for feed reserves. My work has been done. They've reached target weight. I know they're good until March. I can take a break. I can work in my shop. I can go do talks. I can do whatever I want. I don't worry about them anymore. And this is a yard fully wrapped for winter. Thank you.